And when he arrived on campus here, his star was already shining quite bright in design-based implementation research. He is incredibly prolific, and I don't know how many projects he's involved with, but he seems to be involved in far more than, I think I'm busy, but then I look at Bill and I said I'm not busy enough. So, but he is so involved with the community of educators and designers and policymakers. It's amazingly impressive. And the substance of the work that he does really is fascinating, and he forges into new areas. And one of those areas he will talk about tonight. We are pleased to have him to be our opening plenary speaker. And well, without further ado, Bill Penuel.
Thank you, David, for the wonderful introduction. So in some ways, your Thursday speaker, Danny Edelson, raised the question that I'm going to try to answer today for design-based implementation research. When he wrote a paper in 2002 called "What Do We Learn When We Design?" So one way I hope that you will listen is, what do we learn when we engage in design-based implementation research? And today I'm going to actually use a new term to describe the practice of design that I haven't used, and I'm taking the occasion of the talk to really work through some ways that I'm trying to locate design-based implementation research within the Scandinavian tradition of participatory design. And so I'm going to use this practice or term of infrastructure as a way to characterize the nature of collaborative design inside of DBIR. And I'm going to define what I mean by that and how it's used, and maybe I'm misusing it for my purposes here, to talk about how we go about design locally here with our research practice partnership with the Denver Public Schools. And I want to try to characterize what I think we learned through our design efforts. In addition, these are my various Twitter handles at the bottom, and you will, if you follow me, you will notice there will be some ancillary resources popping up here and there to the talk. So I want to begin with a premise that I think many people who engage in design research share, which is that it aims for big transformations to current educational practice, not small ones. We seek not just to develop better tools to meet current goals or standards for student learning. Design studies, as Cobb and colleagues say, argue, are test beds for innovation in which the purpose is to investigate new possibilities for educational improvement by bringing about new forms of learning in order to study them. To the extent that these studies are successful, some argue, the practices we develop in our controlled settings become images that drive the reorganization of schooling in fundamental ways. A good example is the SimCalc Math Worlds program of research, begun more than 2 decades ago by the late Jim Cabot. SimCalc aimed to democratize access to the mathematics of change by bringing fundamental concepts about rates of change to middle schoolers. SimCalc software made its mathematics accessible through linked representations of phenomena familiar to everyday experience. And the materials developed by a team at SRI International integrated this software into a powerful intervention. It represents some of the best of what design research has to offer as an approach to developing and testing powerful interventions. In multiple trials of effectiveness in Texas, Florida, and the UK, SimCalc has proven effective in improving students' mathematical understandings. Another achievement, I think, in the policy realm of design research is embodied in this National Research Council volume of Framework for K-12 Science Education. This consensus volume served as a blueprint for new standards in science education, The research drew heavily on design research, focused on curriculum development that Kate McNeil, just named for, was involved in for its insights on student learning. The standards that were developed from that are intended to serve as an image to guide major reorganizations of science education in the US. Now, the reality is that neither the interventions like SimCalc nor standards per se can bring about systemic transformation or ensure equity within transformed systems. Just a year after research left the Texas schools where they conducted a study of SimCalc, half of the teachers were no longer using the SimCalc materials. It was, moreover, a case of the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer. Those students whose teachers were most likely to still be using the materials were in classrooms with students who were already high achieving in mathematics. New standards, moreover, mean nothing without the hard work of developing new materials, assessments, professional development to go with them, and the work of supporting implementation in ways that make sense to teachers. These things have to all fit together, together for that to work. None of these are easy tasks, and so we need approaches that both draw our attention to how fundamental these tasks are and how to help us develop an understanding of what it will take to create lasting and equitable change. This is the sort of question that DBIR asks, is how can we support the equitable transformation of educational systems through design research? And so this is the approach that, these are the 4 principles or key features of design-based implementation research. As its name implies, it is a blend of 2 different traditions of research. Design research, with its interventionist focus on trying to make changes to systems in order to understand them, but implementation research and policy programs, which typically aims to describe and explain the implementation of policies. So we try to take that interventionist approach of design research and meld it with a focus on implementation. It is a design approach, and I'm going to try to articulate what it is we design when we do DBIR. The 4 key features of DBIR shown on this slide are what define the approach. We say that all 4 have to be present because many projects share one or more of these features. What is distinctive is when they are used in conjunction with one another. The 4 principles or features that are the research effort is, one is that they're focused on problems of practice as negotiated by multiple stakeholders, which typically include educators, educational leaders, researchers, and sometimes young people and their families. The anchoring in practice is key here, as is the idea that the focal problem is something that is negotiated among the partners. It's not what either partner came to do when they first started working together. It's something that comes out of the negotiated process. Second, the commitment is to iterative collaborative design, in which the iterations are informed by what is found by testing designs in the crucible of practice. The what of design is different only insofar as in DBIR there's always, to some degree, designing across levels of a system. And the example I'll give today will illustrate exactly what I mean by that. Third, DBIR aims to produce knowledge and theory that others can use, both to guide practice in the classroom and to aid in supporting implementation of innovations intended for the classroom. And finally, DBIR aims to build the capacity of systems and partnerships like the one that I'm going to describe today to sustain the changes that they make. For me, and the way I interpret this last principle, it is the capacity of a partnership that has an ongoing relationship that is not bounded by time or by project necessarily, a commitment to building its capacity for continuous improvement. I'm going to focus mostly on these middle 2 principles today, although at the end you can ask me questions about any of them. Articulating specifically, because this is the design research center of the work, so both the design work and the knowledge that we produce from it. And to do so, I'm going to borrow a concept from participatory design that I have been finding especially generative as I've been reading in it, and that's the term infrastructure. To understand it, we need to actually go back a couple of decades to Lee Starr and Karen Roulader's definition of infrastructure. Infrastructure, as we normally think of it, is like railroads and highways and electrical grids. And that certainly is infrastructure, but what they also mean is it's something that we really depend on to engage in our everyday practices. They define it as a relational concept. It's when we can do something locally, such as teach a science class, that's afforded by some larger scale technology and materials, and in a way that feels transparent to us, ready to hand, natural. That which is the infrastructure, by definition, is something that fades into the background most of the time. For technology, or the things that we design, technology, I mean this very broadly, like curriculum materials, assessments, to become infrastructural, it has to get folded into organizational changes, become part of what Starr refers to elsewhere as a working infrastructure for the accomplishment of specific tasks. So what is infrastructure? This term was inspired by Bowker and Starr's chapter called How to Infrastructure in their, at the end of their book, Sorting Things Out, a wonderful read I can recommend about how classification schemes are materialized in various layered infrastructures of societies. Articulated by Elena Kavasti and Annalisa Shiranen, infrastructuring is about integrating new tools and technologies with existing networks of people, materials, and tools. The work involves negotiations and compromises along the way. These two scholars, as well as others who study infrastructuring, emphasize two features of infrastructuring. In it, for one, users are involved in the design, not just up front, but as they invent new uses in the field for tools and integrate them to pursue new possibilities for practice that hadn't been imagined up front by designers. There is an assumption that if technologies are to be made useful, practitioners must effectively take up the work of design, appropriating the technology so as to incorporate it into the material environment and the set of practice that they're engaged in. So there are two aspects that are called out in some of the contemporary Scandinavian writing that I will try to pull out in the work that we do locally. One is simply just to think about it as creating the various conditions for social innovation. So we can think of designers as creating conditions in which diverse actors can explore new possibilities and create more sustainable, equal, and just worlds, not just schools, that really affect the causes of social problems merely than relieving its symptoms. This is the equity focus. This is that we're really about creating new possibilities, complete the organizations of the systems that we're after. Designers who may initially be outsiders to a system actually aim to become part of it somehow, cultivating long-term relationships with actors inside the system and building a network that designs together. Relationship building takes primacy in the work. Instead of following predefined plans, design teams often engage in patchwork efforts, focused on continuously matching different stakeholders and their respective agendas. When a match doesn't work, you try another. As Emerson argues, conflicting interests, values, and ways of working often threaten to cause projects to collapse. And you'll see some threats to our project that I share today. And at times, projects are closed down because the different actors don't match with each other as intended. This is not a reason for giving up. Instead, it's a reason to see the matching of people and the creation of constellations as a kind of prototyping process. If one match doesn't work, try another. This is the sort of collaborative engagement with the world of policies and the mess of schools that design-based implementation research embraces and says, no, that's not policy and implementation over there, it's design here. It's part of our work. It's claiming it as what we do. And part of that is and that centers around building the relationships and maintaining them. The second component is really around how do we actually go about redesigning infrastructures. And this really draws on Starr and Ruleger's concept of a working infrastructure. We focus our design on creating a working infrastructure around a particular system or technology that's being designed, and it means making sure that it plugs into other infrastructures and tools in a standardized way. Designers aim to learn from and plan for how the organizational structures are going to influence the design and use of innovations, by making visible what's the existing infrastructures and the work that people do to maintain it. And it's key, though, even if you know what these things are, studying it in advance is not enough, because the work of maintaining infrastructures is continuous. If you work in any school district, you know how true this is. And not under the control, and it's also not under the control of any one actor, which is something that every design team has to wrestle with. So in this connection, transforming systems through infrastructure is both, I would say, challenging and elucidating, requiring teams to enroll other actors in endeavors to construct more equitable workplaces, communities, and educational systems. Design teams have to start someplace with some group of actors with the full knowledge that the work's going to require them to evolve the focus of their efforts and the teams that are engaged in the work. And I have the word "re" in here for a reason, which is that none of us walk into these systems as if they didn't exist before. So when we are engaging in infrastructure, and we are always redesigning infrastructures, not doing so from de novo. While infrastructuring is a way to characterize the nature of our collaborative design work and its focus, we need a little more refined set of theories that can help to guide our design decisions that we're seeking to test, refine, and elaborate. So I would say infrastructuring is kind of like a meta theory of design. In DDIR, there are always at least two layers of theory to engage. The first is layered and centered around a theory of how students learn. In our partnership that I'm going to describe here, we're guided by conceptions of disciplinary learning in science that are reflected in the research reported in a framework for K-12 science education. These ideas represent a synthesis of science learning drawn from a range of socio-cognitive and sociocultural perspectives on learning. They are transformative in the sense that the vision of the framework, if it were to be broadly implemented, would represent a major change to how teaching and learning is organized in U.S. schools today. The framework promotes a vision of equity in which all students are expected to meet demanding goals for science proficiency, and a vision of diversity that emphasizes the need to link instruction to students' everyday experiences and interests, so as to help them identify with science and engineering as cultural endeavors. The tools that we employ to facilitate design are intended to scaffold our joint attention to the vision of the framework and commitments to promoting equity and diversity in science education. And this is where we diverge, and I think what makes DDIR different is the second layer of theory, which is related to the organizational context in which designs are going to be implemented. These pertain to how it is that you can support teacher and leader learning. How do organizational routines support innovation in practice and stabilization of practice when you have practices that you want to keep? How do policies support teachers in implementing certain things? How do technology systems need to be supporting and augmenting the capacity of teachers to support learning and assess their students' learning? How can external partners in our case like us, help school districts to make changes, to add expertise to the system and support the ongoing work? Policy theories in particular, really help us to think through these various issues. In our particular project, we draw on concepts from institutional theory as developed within studies of local policymaking and education. Folks like Patricia Burge, Brian Rowan, and Jim Spillane are people who influence our thinking. Now, these policy theories both anticipate and elaborate on things like the ways that people organize, on how people organize these various topics. And I'll say in a minute, one of the most generative ones is this new idea that is coming out of the work by Jim Spillane and Megan Hopkins on something called instructional guidance infrastructure, which also goes back and traces some origins back to David Cohen's work. So policy theories like this, like instructional guidance infrastructure, suggest to us as designers where to look for potential sources of conflict and guidance to teachers. And they provide us a focus for our infrastructuring activities. They tell us what we might have to design for. American schools and districts, fortunately for us, and this is what makes this something that can travel beyond Denver public schools, they have a lot of similarities in terms of the components that make up the instructional guidance infrastructure. A district's infrastructure usually